Hello everyone. In this week's lecture, we're going to be covering the basics of animation within Adobe Animate CC. We're going to introduce the concepts of what can be animated, how it can be animated, the types of animation that are available to us in this program or in this environment, and how we can use the different combinations of those things into what turns into proper interactive experiences for our users or viewers. So with that in mind, let's get started. I'm going to create, as I've been doing so far, I will be creating a new stage just by create new. And I am going to maintain the settings that I had used last time, 640 by 480 at 30 FPS. Once again, as a reminder, I'm working under the character animation templates, but again, you can change that to whatever you want. It's completely customizable. I will maintain it under ActionScript for now, and I will maintain my frame rate at 30 FPS. Remember, anything that is above 15 FPS will work well for what we're doing in terms of animation. So I'll maintain it at 30. So let's go ahead and click Create on this, and my new stage will be open with the default layer and an empty keyframe. The very first keyframe is empty. Remember, keyframe is a point in time where something happens. And then I can see the properties for this particular document that I'm working on the property panel on the right hand side. Let me stretch my tools to have the 2 column. And by the way, I've been doing this every single time that I've been opening the program. So I would like to maintain this particular style, the way I have things set up right now, which is by default is the essentials. So if I go to look into the different workspaces that I have, by the way, we now have workspaces in Adobe Animate CC. This wasn't available before. You have different options. So you could create your own workspace. And then you can go ahead and, save it if you want to, or switch to something like developer, which will switch my my interface around to something that is, that would be more advantageous to a developer. And if I go to, say, for example, classic, this might be the way you're used to seeing the program if you had worked with Flash in the past. So you have the ability to choose different formats for what you're working with. Again, you can also save this workspaces if you want to. If you want to maintain it. Very few people actually do, but if you are an avid worker, if you're someone that is using this environment quite often, I suggest that you make use of that ability to save the workspace. So let's go ahead, and into this composition, I will be bringing in, actually before I bring in anything, let's talk about what types of animation we can have within Adobe Animate CC. And I know that sounds odd, but it depends on what you are trying to animate, that different types of animation will be available to you. So in order to animate something, I've been saying it from the beginning, you need to make sure that whatever is animated resides in its own layer. So in this case, if I wanted to have 3 items animated separately, independent of each other or linked, they need to reside within their own layers. That's the first thing that needs to happen. The second thing that needs to happen is to define whether you want the item to be animated as an object or you want it to be animated as a shape. As you saw in the previous lecture on week 2, we talked about the differences between shapes and objects. So if I want to work with objects, then I need to animate in a very specific way. If I want to animate as shapes, then I need to modify the way I animate. And which one is better than the other? It all depends on what your end result is going to be and what your workflow is. For user interfaces or for user experiences, we tend to work with objects. And that is because objects allow us to create what we call symbols. And these symbols, then we can go ahead and control via code. So eventually, if we want to create true interactive experiences, we want to make sure that we have these objects from at the beginning, so that we can then modify, change them into symbols and then code them. But if we are truly just working on the program for animating purposes, then objects are an option and shapes are another option. You have a little bit more of a wider field. So how do I differentiate one from the other? Well, let's take a look at very basic stuff. Let's go ahead and work with a rectangle. On the layer 1, I'm going to double click it to rename it. I'm going to call it square. And I'm going to call it square shape so that I remember that this is a shape. And on that empty keyframe, with that empty keyframe selected, I will be creating a box. Now, for this box, I don't want to have any stroke. So I'll go to either the properties window to change that for it, or I can click on that swatch down at the bottom of my tools area and click on the little red line, the one that crosses this way. That's the empty swatch, so that I have no stroke when I'm creating what I'm about to create. Then I'll make sure that as I go ahead and work on this, I am going to press shift to create a rectangle square. And if I click on it, you'll notice that it's just a fill. Remember, when I was working on that tool to create it, I didn't click on this button here, and that would have made it an object. So right now, this is a shape. I can verify that by selecting it and making sure that I look into the properties name and I see that this is called a shape. So therefore, that is just basically a fill. It's a shape that was created inside the program. It also filled out my keyframe over here. So that means that frame has been filled out. Now, let's say I want to animate this thing to move it across the screen. So in order to do that, I need to define certain things. And this is where we start talking about the basic physics of animation. This is something that we talked about during our live lecture. So just as a reminder, we need to take into account when we're creating animation for interactivity, we not only need to take into account the 12 principles of animation that we reviewed during the class, but we also need to take into account timing and pacing. We need to take into account size. We need to take into account gravity. We need to take into account resistance, and we need to take into account action reaction. So those are the basics of physics that we take into account when we are creating interactivity for user interfaces, or when we're talking about interactive presentations for users. These are also something that are underlined, the basic principles of animation as we saw it during the presentation in class. So let's say, for example, I want this thing to move across the screen. Then I need to define, well, how long do you want that action to take? And so you will say, okay, I want it to take, let's say, 1 second of animation. Then you would go to your timeline, and then based on that preset that you're going to say, okay, I'm going to move this square, this rectangle across the screen in 1 second. I need to create a second keyframe of that animation. Remember, a point in time where something happens is what we call a keyframe. So when it starts moving, that would be my first keyframe, which is where we are right now. The end frame, which is where we end our animation, or whenever something happens, let's say it changes direction or something else happens, it increases in size, whatever happens. The second action, which in our case is going to be when it stops, will be happening on frame 30. So I want to make a copy of that frame, that first frame, onto that frame 30, and then I'll simply move the second instance of that rectangle. So how to do that? Well, I'll select the frame 30 by clicking on it. You'll notice that it gets highlighted, but my time marker remains on frame 1, which is okay because I have no other tween frames. I don't have any tween frames in between the two frames. Then all I need to do is create a copy of that keyframe. From what we saw, the things that I've been talking about in class, you have either shortcuts to do it, which would be F6, the F6 key on the keyboard, or you could just go ahead and click on this drop-down menu and say, what do I want? So if you want to say, I want a keyframe, then you could just say keyframe, and then it made a copy. As you can see, I am now on frame 30, my time marker is there, and I see a copy of the file. If I move behind that in this empty area here where there are no keyframes, that would be where I would be creating my animation. So this would be my first keyframe, and this would be my last keyframe, the beginning and the end points of this action. So with that done, let me place my time marker over my frame 30, making sure that I am in that frame. I'll go ahead and click on it to select it, and then I'll go ahead and click on the artwork and move it across the screen. So now what happens is right now my second instance, that second keyframe instance of that shape is on this side of the stage. But if I move my time marker right behind that, it's going to jump back to the left hand side because that's the area that this frame covers. There is no change in between those two things all the way to frame 29. Once you pass frame 29, the box jumps to the other side. So how do I activate the animation between these two shapes? Because of what I just said, because these are shapes, then I would have to apply what we call a shape tween. So there are three modes of animation. Shapes use shape tweening, and the other two use motion tweening. So what can you do with shape tweening? Well, let's take a look and see how we activate that animation. To assign animation to this layer, what we'll do is we'll right-click on the first keyframe, select it, or right-click it, simply right-click it, and then you'll see that you have the different formats of animation up here. So you could do classic tween, which is for objects, motion tween, which is for objects and symbols, and shape tween, which is for shapes, as the name says it. So we want a shape tween in this case because that's what we had created, shape tweening. Make sure that you understand the difference between them. Classic tween and motion tween are for objects and for symbols. Shape tweening is for shapes. Do not make one the other, because then the program will create instances of movie clips and things like that, symbols in your library that you might not be aware of. In order to compensate, the program will try to animate no matter what. But in order to do so, if you choose the wrong type of animation, it might create extra items for you that you might be unaware of. And so if in the future you need to make a change, then you're going to run into difficulties because you have things that you were not made aware by the program that it had to create for you in order to balance out that you were asking it to create animation in a way that it didn't expect. So it's simple. Just know that for shapes, you need shape tweening. For everything else, you use the other two. So now let's click on shape tween really quick, and you'll notice that I get an orange area in my tween area, in my tween frames between frames 2 and 29. That is my tween area. My keyframe remains full, and then keyframe 30 stays as well. But now my shape is moving across the screen. So I have created an animation, and if I hit the playback button, my rectangle will move across the screen. Okay. Now, what happens now? Why would we want to have shape? This is fairly straightforward, as you can see. This is just a rectangle, and nothing fantastic is happening right now. But let's go ahead and create a new layer. And you'll notice now, because I have more frames than the first one, any subsequent layer will fill that empty keyframe that is created with that new layer, will fill the space on the timeline all the way to the last keyframe available within your timeline. So basically now if I put something on this layer 2 on frame 1, it will occupy all that space all the way to frame 30 of that layer. It's that keyframe basically controls that entire area until I tell it not to. And that's what I'm about to do. So let's go ahead and take a look at what I can do. Let me lock the square shape layer, just to make sure that I do not select it by accident. Make sure I have the second layer selected, and then I'm going to call this one morph. And that's because I will be morphing a shape into another shape. So to do so, I will go ahead and create an empty keyframe on frame 30. So I'll select that frame 30 on the morph layer, and then go to my drop down and set a blank keyframe, which gives me an empty keyframe, as you can see. So let's go back to the first keyframe, and in that keyframe, I am going to create a rectangle. There you go. Then on my second keyframe, I will be creating a circle, and I'm going to place it right on this area. Now, the two shapes are completely different. There's a rectangle, there's a circle. But because they are shapes, they're basically almost like Play-Doh, as I explained in our previous lecture, then I have the ability to morph one shape into another. Let me go ahead and right-click on the first keyframe, on the morph layer, and apply a shape tween and see. Let's take a look and see what happens. As I scrub my video, you'll notice that my shape converts onto the second shape. Okay. So this is one of the advantages of working with shapes. Now let me stretch out my viewing area for this animation, and you'll notice that basically it just morphs as it goes. So that is pretty cool because shapes allow you to do that. That is shape tweening. It allows you to do basically modifications between an object and another. So if you want to create organic animations, shape tweening would be the way to go. In some other instances, you want to take advantage of the ability of working with objects, because it's a lot easier to to control an object. With shape tweening, you can exert a certain amount of control on what you do with the animation. But the truth be told is it takes a lot more work to fine tune the shaping of objects between one and the other, due to the nature of how things change. So if you don't want to spend a lot of time modifying shapes from one shape to the next, and this is for things like major modifications like what you just saw here. But if it's one frame to another frame modification, then shape tweening works really well, and it's at that point becomes almost no different than working on a frame by frame animation, which is what some people use this program for, because as you can see, it's fairly easy to work with and create the timeline as you go. And then mix into that the fact that you have the ability to edit multiple frames or create onion skinning, then you have a lot of big set of tools to work with. For example, let's activate onion skinning. You'll see right here on the onion skinning tool that is giving me the amount of frames before and after. It colorizes them from blue to red to green, blue being the past, green being the future, and the red exactly where my time marker is. And it tells me what is happening in each one of those frames as the thing is tweening. So if you are thinking about doing frame by frame animation, this is basically almost like moving the sheets. You are basically you have the ability to see how things are going to be going back and forward. So you have references in order to do frame by frame animation, if you're so inclined. Some of you I know come from the experimental animation class, and you might want to try that in this program. For that, then you would need to equip yourself with a good Wacom tablet. I wouldn't suggest doing hand-drawn animation with a mouse. It would just take forever. But you have the ability. So get equipped with the proper tools in order to do what you're planning to do, and you have that ability. We're going to be talking about onion skinning a little bit more in the near future, and in more detail how to dig into it and modify things in order to take advantage of onion skinning. For now, let me turn it off. And let's move on to the next type of animation. So for the next type of animation, we need to create objects to start with, or you can start with a shape, but the shape needs to be converted eventually into what I've been mentioning from the beginning, what we call symbols. Now, a symbol is almost like a prepackaged version of whatever artwork you have created. And that means is almost like you make a copy of it, store it in the library, and then you start working with instances of that item that is in the library. So similar to the way we brought in images in the previous class and they resided in the library and then we saw them also on the stage. The difference with symbols, however, is that you can define what the symbols will do for you. What kind of data will be used with those symbols. In other words, you can use the actual definition of the symbol to either be a graphic, or you can define it to be what we call a movie clip, which contains a timeline of its own, meaning inside it is a timeline of its own, very similar in concept to what we use as precompositions in After Effects. So basically, it is almost like a one-frame condensation of a bunch of layers and timelines. And the thing is that you can keep on embedding timelines inside timelines inside timelines as you go. Now, the more that you create this embedding, the more complicated your movies will get. So you need to keep an eye on how far you can or should create this amount of embedding. And the other option for symbols is creating buttons. So buttons will be most useful actually, because they save us a lot of time from coding actual button actions. So how do you create a symbol? Well, let's go ahead and with what we've been doing, let's go ahead and create a new layer, double click its name and call it symbol. And in this symbol layer, we're going to be adding a rectangle. So now this rectangle in this case I'm going to create as an object. Okay. So now the object, this rectangle as an object, you'll notice that it has the little blue outline around it when I select it, different than what I had before with these guys, which was the fill only. This one is a symbol. If I wanted to animate this, before I create the animation of the two options that I have on my drop-up menu, the classic tween and motion tween, I would have to convert that item into a symbol. If I do not convert it into a symbol, then this is where what I mentioned a few minutes ago comes in. The program will create the symbol for me. It will name it something without telling me what it named it, and then it would store it in the library. As you can see, there's nothing currently in the library. If I apply the animation, the program will force that symbol into the library and will name it whatever it wants to name it. 99.9% of the time, you don't want that to happen. If you're in a hurry, it works. But my advice is that in order to keep things organized, you intentionally turn things into symbols so that they do not get naming conventions that you don't follow. So how do you turn something into a symbol? You select the object, then you go into modify, and then you say convert to symbol. Shortcut F8. So when you do that, what's going to happen is a window is going to open and it's going to ask you, hey, I have questions for you. Let me collapse the advanced options because we don't need this at this stage of the class. We simply need to see up here what we need for now. So what do I want to turn this into? Since I only have one timeline and it's at the top level of the scene one, meaning I don't have any sub-levels, nothing is embedded. This is all at the top level of the scene, meaning this is the only timeline I have. Then I want to turn that into a graphic that I can move around. The options are, as I said before, movie clip, button, and graphic. Now, the difference between a movie clip and a graphic is that a movie clip will give you the ability to embed timelines inside it. So you can have an animation inside an animation inside an animation that turns into one single frame. And when you play it back, all of the animations will play because they have been embedded. So they exist on sub-level timelines. A button is a movie clip that only has 4 states. It has an off, an on, an over, and the area that you can click. Those are the 4 stages, the 4 states of a button. We'll see how those are created in a few. And then graphics, it's like a movie clip, but it doesn't have the timeline inside it. Now, if you double click into a graphic and you go inside it, you're going to see a timeline. But the timeline doesn't work because it is a graphic. So graphics by themselves don't have anything inside them that can be animated. So if I just simply want to say I want a graphic, that is just fine. Now it's going to tell me where do you want to store this, and by default it saves it into your library. You can also choose at this point where the registration point, meaning the point of reference from where anything happens to that graphic, is going to be. And by default it is at the center, but if you want to keep it on the upper left hand corner, you can click there, or you can place it wherever you want. For now I'm going to leave it as the default in the center, and then I'll name this, and this is good. This is important. You need to give proper naming to your symbols. This I'm going to call square. Notice that I use a capital letter. Do not use any spaces. Do not use any numbers at the beginning of the names. Usually tend to start with a capital letter. That is my naming convention. You don't have to do that, but it's my naming convention and that of many programmers. So when you go into working with a team of developers, they would appreciate that you have named your symbols in a way that they can understand and that they can easily manipulate. So if I click OK on this by calling it square, you'll notice that square appears here. You'll notice that it has a little graphic that looks like a rectangle, a triangle, and a circle. And that symbol, that icon, indicates that that is a graphic. If I select that on the stage and I go to its properties, it's going to tell me it is a graphic and it's an instance of square, which is that one that is here. So it resides here and it's telling me, yes, you have a copy of it on the stage. Now, if by accident you delete that from the stage, you still retain it inside the library. It doesn't go anywhere. It is now part of the library. You can at any time click on the icon and drag it onto the stage, and you can make many copies of it. You can keep on clicking and having as many copies as you want of it without significantly increasing the size of your file. So that is an advantage of having symbols. Notice also that my keyframe got filled out, so that means that is ready for animation. And let's take a look at what we can do with this particular symbol. So several things can happen. You can go ahead and change the sizing to scale it, rotating, all kinds of things that you can do with this symbol. You can also apply effects to this. So here's where you find most of the effects that you would find that would be found for modifying the actual thing, as if you were applying filters in Photoshop or in After Effects. You can also change the alpha information from here. So if I want this to be semi-transparent, I can click on alpha, and you'll notice that by default that was changed to 52, and my file got semi-transparent. So you can actually apply color effects from there. That said, let's see how we apply animation to this object. We can go ahead and right click on the keyframe at the beginning and choose whether we want classic tween or motion tween. Now, classic tween is the way we used to animate in the past, and for it we need to have 2 keyframes to get going. If we create motion tween, which is the newest way of animating, you only need to have 1 keyframe to get started, and then as you make changes to your symbols, the keyframes will be created for you. So let's take a look at classic tween first. If I click on classic tween, you'll notice that this gives me a purple layer telling me there is tweening now here, but you're not going anywhere. There's no frame, no extra frame to go to. So how do I create that extra keyframe? Well, for classic tweening, we do it the same way as we did with the shape tween. We select the last frame, we go to the drop down here and say, I want a keyframe, and it will create a copy of that frame for you. Now, the first frame and the last frame are the same. You will notice that your marching ants line, the dotted line, turned into a solid arrow. And now with that frame still selected, let me click on the symbol on the stage, and I'm gonna move it to the right hand side. Now, if you'll notice, the box moves across the screen the same way as the shape did. So no major difference between those things. Now, I want to move all this up. Your first inclination would be to, okay, let me unlock all the layers, select everything, and move everything up. If you do so, take a look at the bottom of the timeline right now. You will notice that everything at the beginning has been selected, but these items have not been selected. These frames were not selected. So this modified the entire animation. Okay, so be careful when doing that. If you want to modify, if you want to move a whole bunch of keyframes at the same time, you need to make sure that you activate this edit multiple frames. Now, you can go ahead and choose how many frames you want by saying select range. So you can actually stretch how many frames you want. You can say, in this case, I want to move all of them. So I'll say, okay, select all frames. And it's going to create a selection that, as you can see, encompasses everything, the beginning and the end position of my frames. It's going to showcase everything. If I want to move everything, then I need to select all, meaning I need to select everything that's on the stage. I can go Edit, Select All, or Control-A or Command-A on the Mac. Now you'll notice that all of the frames get selected, everything is highlighted on the timeline, all my artwork seems to be outlined or selected. So when I go ahead and move my artwork and I move it up, now let me turn off that select range by clicking on it again. Now deselect everything, and you'll notice that I simply moved my layer animations up on the stage. So everything still moving on the x-axis, and all animations now move evenly, not as before that they were going sideways when I simply moved the beginning portions. This is very important to remember, that you need to have, in order to move an entire set of animated keyframes, you need to use the select all, the range selector over here, the edit multiple frames selector. So now let's go ahead and create one last layer, and I'm going to drag it up to the top, double click it, and I'm going to call it motion. And in this one, I am going to create this. I'm going to create a circle just to be a bit different. I'm going to create a circle, and that circle right now is an object because I had highlighted that thing in the previous, when I created the previous rectangle. Now I can make you don't have to have an object in order to create a symbol. I know I said this before, but I want to reiterate it. So I can create a shape, and then simply by going into modify and may convert to symbol, I can go ahead and turn that shape into a symbol. As a matter of fact, this object right here, it's an object, drawing object, as you can see on the under the properties. But if I double click it, I am inside that drawing object. You'll notice that I went one level down. We saw this in the last class. This is the same principle as what you do when you're working in Illustrator. If you create an object in Illustrator and you double click on it, you go one level down. So that's why you have the breadcrumbs appearing on the upper left-hand corner of your stage. If I select it now, you'll notice that that is basically what we know to be a shape. And you don't have to actually go all the way down to make it to see this. Let's go back to the scene one again, all the way to the top level. Let me select that object and I can break it apart. So if I want to break apart that object, I can just go ahead and press Control B or Command B on the keyboard. Control B or Command B, B as in boy. And that turns that object now from an object into a shape. And this is now a shape. So I can now modify that as if it was Play-Doh. As you can see, when I go to the edge, you'll notice that my mouse shows me that little curve. That means I can modify the curvature of the object. Okay, so and that it's now a shape. So with the shape selected, as I said, you don't have to use an object, you can use a shape. I can go ahead and say modify that shape, please convert it into a symbol, and I'm going to call this symbol circle. And I am going to maintain it as a graphic for now. I'm going to keep everything else as is. And I'll click OK. You will notice now that in the library we have a square symbol and a circle symbol. Just like with the other one, I can delete it and bring it back if I need to. In the timeline, I am going to go to the first keyframe for that layer. I'm going to right click and then I'm going to go create motion tween. Now you'll notice that the motion tween created a yellow highlight on the layer, which indicates to me that's a motion tween. So this is motion tween, purple is classic motion tween, and the orange one down here is shape tweening. Now let's go all the way to frame 30 and simply move my instance. And you'll notice that right away, just by doing that, it created a second keyframe for you down here. That keyframe looks almost like a little diamond, which should be familiar to those of you who have worked with After Effects. That little diamond indicates that there is motion happening or changes happening coming into that frame, and it's ready to continue if I so do changes after that particular frame. So it knows that that's a keyframe, that is a point of change. And there is my animation. The other thing that this gave me was this visual path, which is extremely useful when you're animating, because with the path, as you can see, as I go over the actual path, I can go ahead and modify the path in order to change the animation. So I can make things go faster at the beginning and slower at the end, as you can see. Notice that the space between the tween frames get elongated here. The elongated space between the tween frames means that your animation will go a lot more space in the same amount of time. When the tween frames get close to one another, that means slow down. So visually, I can see that this starts fairly fast and it starts slowing down as it goes to the end. As my tween frames get closer to one another, that's an indicator that my animation will be easing out. That's what we call that, or slowing down. That's one of the things that we saw from the principles of animation during the lecture. And then when they are separated from one another, that means you're speeding up. So that means easy ease in, meaning that this thing is basically going to take off and not ease into this particular, it's going to ease into this frame, but it's going to be very fast on this side. So let's take a look at how that animation plays out. As you can see, that circle takes off a lot faster than the rest of the graphics and slows down into its next keyframe. You probably noticed as well that just making that differentiation in shape of the path and the speed of playback actually makes that motion look a lot more natural than the other ones. The other ones almost look mechanical. Let's go ahead and loop this animation and take a look. So it's more of a smoother animation, which is one of the things that we were talking about when we talked about those basics of the basic physics in user interfaces, which include in this case timing and pacing. Pacing being whether we want to easy ease in or easy ease out, which is that principle that we talked about, slow in, slow out in regular animation. So these are the different types of animations that you can create in Adobe Animate CC, and the different elements that you need to choose or work with depending on the type of animation that you're pursuing. Now, is one better than the other, or is one faster than the other? No, it all depends on what your end result is going to be, what you're going for, meaning your target. And it also depends on what you work with fastest. So it's all based on your capabilities and what workflow you find that's going to work best for you. So we will move on from this into actually doing an exercise for applying these animations and being able to start manipulating graphics, manipulating symbols, and manipulating shapes in order to create proper animation in Animate.